The Firewall/ACL service request provides users a means to request the addition and removal of rules on firewalls and routers managed by the Department of Technology. There are several ways you can locate the Firewall/ACL request form. One is to browse to it within Service Request Management. It's located underneath the Network Services category, and then Firewall/ACL. To submit a request this way, you can simply click the Request Now button. An alternate method to find the request is to use the search bar and search for Firewall. You click the magnifying glass to execute the search. You will see Firewall/ACL on the list right here. And you can start a new request by simply clicking it. The request form contains detailed instructions to assist you with completion of the form. You can access those by clicking here and then clicking the View Detailed Instructions. The form is comprised of 3 different sections. The upper section of the form is the header. The middle section of the form is the firewall rule input form, and the lower section of the form is the firewall rule request table. Let's start by talking about the header. All of the bolded fields within the header are required. The first thing you want to do is select the appropriate billing prefix for your organization. The next thing is to select an approver. There is space for 2 additional improvers, and whether or not you need to select those will depend on your organizational processes and requirements. If your organization does not require additional approvers, you may enter none as the approver. The next item that is required is the summary field. This is essentially a title of your request. The final field is the project/application field. This is used to tie the firewall request to a specific project or application. It's also suggested that you fill out the request details field, as this field could provide additional details about the request for those who will be approving and implementing it. The firewall rule input form in the center of the window is used to populate the firewall rule request table in the lower section. All bolded fields within the firewall input form are required to be completed. Several of the fields are populated with a default value to make completing the form more convenient. You may change those values if necessary. The first field to focus on is the action field. Do you want to add a rule to the firewall or remove a rule? The default is add. The next item is address translation. In this option, you select whether or not there is any address translation occurring with respect to the source or the destination address in this request. The default is none. Let's move on to the source and destination information. The first thing you need to do is select the source function. Please pick the function that most aligns with the source device that's part of this request. In this example, we're going to assume it's a web server. The next field allows you to determine the source to define the source type. Options include host single, which is a single IP address, host multiple, which is multiple IP addresses separated by commas, host range, which is a range of IP addresses where the first 3 octets are the same, MCS resource pool, which is an MCS resource pool, firewall object group, which is the name of an existing firewall object group known by the submitter, and subnet, which uses subnet ID and subnet mask to specify a range of addresses. Depending on the source or destination type that you select, required additional information will show to the right. For example, if your firewall source request will be for a single host, you must supply the IP address and the host name. For multiple hosts, you must supply the IP address of each host separated by a comma, as well as the host name of each host, also separated by a comma. For example, 1.1.1.1, 2.2.2.2.2, and my host 1, my host 2. For a range of hosts, you must supply the first 3 octets of the address and the beginning and ending value of the last octet. For example, if you wanted 10.10.10.1 to 10.10.10.99, you would enter 10.10.10 and then 1 and then 99. Optionally, you can specify the host names of the devices in the range separated by commas. For a subnet, you must supply the subnet ID and the network mask. For example, if you want to include IP addresses .1 to .26, you would enter the subnet ID 10.10.10.0 and the mask /25. For an MCS resource pool, you supply the subnet ID and the resource pool name. For an object group, you supply the name of the object group. We need to touch on 2 more areas of the firewall input form. The protocol dropdown is used to specify the protocol associated with the rule. The default is TCP, which is the most often used, but it may also need to be UDP, ICMP, or in rare cases, one of the other options. The port dropdown and port field are used to specify the port or ports associated with the source and destination addresses entered above. Valid options for port type include port single for a single port, port multiple for a comma-separated list of ports, port range for a range of ports, and service group to specify a known service group. Let's add a sample line to the firewall rule request table. In this example, we are going to assume that we have 3 web servers that we want to be able to communicate with an application server using ports TCP/80 and TCP/443. For the source function, I will select web server. For source type, I will select host multiple and enter the IP addresses separated by a comma. 1.1.1.1, 2.2.2.2, 3.3.3.3, and then I'll enter my host names, web 1, web 2, and web 3. For destination function, I'll select application. For destination type, I'll leave the default of host single, and I'll enter the destination IP of 4.4.4.4 and a host name of app1. For protocol, I'll leave the default as TCP. For port type, I'll select multiple and enter 80, 443. Now, I'll click Add to add the data in the input form into the firewall rule request table. If your source or destination type is either host multiple or host range, the firewall row confirmation dialog will appear. This will show you an expanded version of all the IPs and host names you entered, so you can confirm everything is correct. If you see a mistake, you can click Return and fix it. For our example, it looks fine, so I'm going to click Confirm. Notice that the input data remains on the firewall rule input form. That is so you can easily add a second line that contains almost identical data. Let's assume I had a second app server that I forgot to enter. I'll just change the destination address to 5.5.5.5 and the host name to app2, and then I click the Add button to add the updated data and review the input on the firewall row confirmation dialog and click OK. Confirm. You'll notice the additional lines were added to the firewall request table. You can click the Clear button to clear all input on the input form and reset everything to default values. The firewall request form has some functionality to check if your request might be a violation of Department of Technology security policy. In this example, I'm requesting access from a web server to a database server. This is something that is not permitted per policy. When I attempt to add this line, I will receive a warning message that I have to specify the exception request number. This is where I would enter the service request number associated with an approved exception request. If you are unable to provide this information, your request will be rejected. If you have an approved exception request, please enter it in the field and click Apply. There are also cases where there is not enough information to determine if the requested firewall rule is a violation of policy or not. For example, if I have an appliance and I want it to be able to talk to a database server over port 500, the system will ask for an explanation of the purpose of the appliance. So I provide an explanation. And then the line gets added to the table. Please provide the requested information or your request may be rejected. Continue to repeat the process we have documented here until the table at the bottom of the form contains all the rules that you are requesting. Then you may click the Submit button.